Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished speakers and honorable guests. I'm very honored to moderate this special session on the name of the Singapore Summit. As we always, perceive, one of the characteristic features of the North Korean nuclear issue is that whenever we have this kind of conference, it's always timely. Today it is more especially special and timely in the sense that Secretary Pompeo has his fourth visit to North Korea and just returned. And also, North Korea invited inspectors to the Punggye-ri North Korean nuclear test site. And last week, I had some one-week visit to Washington think tanks, and New York, and Boston, and Los Angeles, think tank. There's many ramifications of my feelings and observation, but one of the, if I summary in one sentence, the professional pessimism, is prevailing over cautious optimism. That is general, atmosphere of United States vis-a-vis North Korean nuclear issues. Especially, of course, the President Trump is holding unconscious optimism. So that is a typical situation. Our group has met with Senator Menendez, who is committee chair of foreign policy. He made a very balanced conclusion that while acknowledging the risk of at play, but at the same time, the U.S. and China should take full advantage of this historic opportunity. So maybe we have to be very careful with the sense that now we have to take care. We should take care of the element of risk, and at the same time, the element of opportunity. So in that sense, I'd like to invite some very invaluable comment first on the general observation and assessment in the wake of the Singapore Summit, and second, what should be done for the future. So, I already provided some questions, but I'd like I'm very open to whatever comment and observation for the first 5 to 7 minutes. And then we will have some second round, interactive discussion, and followed by Q&A session, by opening the floor. So maybe, and then I will, before we open Q&A session, I will invite some ambassadors, who is working in Seoul, will make some brief comment, on our debate. So, without further ado, I'd like to invite my first speakers, Professor Gary Seymour, who is working as a Senior Executive Director of the Crown Center of Middle East Studies at Brandeis University, and he's also worked as a Senior Fellow at the Belfast Center of Harvard University. Gary, as everybody in the room is well aware of, he is called as a working dictionary in North Korean nuclear issues. Gary and myself joined North Korean nuclear club since early 1990s. So maybe he, on top of that, he worked for 2 Democratic presidents in the White House. So during the Obama administration, he worked as a White House coordinator for arms control and weapons of mass destruction. And during Clinton administration, he served as special assistant to President Clinton and senior director for non-proliferation and export control. So let's welcome Professor Gary Seymour for his initial presentation. Hi, Gary, you have the floor.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, President Park and the Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies, and thank you to the World Knowledge Forum for giving us this opportunity. I'd like to focus on President Trump's strategy toward North Korea. And in particular, I believe that that strategy has started to shift. You'll remember that the original U.S. position after the Singapore summit was to demand that North Korea take immediate steps to declare its full nuclear capabilities, infrastructure, and arsenal, and take very rapid measures to give up those capabilities. That strategy didn't work. And I think the Trump administration has recognized that they need to shift to a more incremental strategy, partial steps toward denuclearization in exchange for partial steps toward building a peace regime. In other words, the approach advocated by all the other countries engaged in this process, South Korea, North Korea, China, Russia, and so forth. And in particular, I think the Trump administration has accepted the recent Kim Jong-un proposal to dismantle Yongbyon in exchange for corresponding measures from the United States as a basis for holding a second summit between President Trump and Chairman Kim. Now, of course, there are many details that have to be resolved to carry out this Kim Jong-un's proposal. We'll need to define what facilities at Yongbyon are going to be permanently dismantled, what would be required for dismantlement, how would it be verified. We'll need to define what corresponding measures mean. Presumably, it includes a peace declaration of some kind. Presumably, North Korea is also seeking some partial sanctions relief. So all of that will have to be specified. And finally, and most importantly, the sequencing of events will have to be determined. For example, if the U.S. agrees to a peace declaration, should that be issued at the beginning of dismantlement, in the middle, or at the end? Those are the kind of issues that I think need to be worked out at the working level by Steve Biegun and his counterpart, Vice Foreign Minister Che Song-hui. And I think one of the important things that came out of Secretary Pompeo's meetings in Pyongyang earlier, a few days ago, is agreement to have working level talks. So I hope President Trump is patient and lets the negotiators try to settle some of these critical issues before rushing into a second summit. If we go into the summit without adequate preparation, then I think the U.S. loses a lot of leverage to resolve these key issues. One of the most important consequences of this shift in President Trump's policy, which I support because I think it's the only way forward, but it means that denuclearization is going to stretch out for many, many years. And President Trump has already acknowledged that by saying, let's not worry about how quickly denuclearization happens. And as a consequence of that, I think it's critically important that the U.S. and South Korea preserve bargaining leverage. The destruction or dismantlement of Yongbyon is a very modest first step. There are many more steps that are far more significant, including declaration, shutdown and dismantlement of secret nuclear facilities, and of course reduction and eventual elimination of North Korea's existing nuclear arsenal. So it's important that we preserve bargaining leverage in the form of both political and economic steps that we can use to try to achieve those more difficult and more important measures. I frankly doubt those steps can be accomplished during President Trump's first term, but I think President Trump and Chairman Kim are on a pathway to at least begin to take modest steps that will lead toward or could lead toward denuclearization and a peace regime in the very long term. Thank you.
If I give some quick question, you expected it will take very long, but in that case, there's some argument that even in that time, during that time, North Korea is expanding its capability, and especially in fissile material. So, fissile material is related to the future, proliferation. So, usually you have frequently mentioned on the necessity of moratorium of fissile material. Right. So that is my first question. And second question is, you described the Yongbyon facility dismantlement as a modest one. I agree with you. Most of the facilities are well-known, already well-known. But we have to pay attention to the enriched uranium facilities, which a hacker visited 10 years ago. But because that is very closely related with the capacity of North Korea's production of the uranium, enriched uranium. So that is another key element to make a final, denuclearization process. So you may respond later or now. It's up to you.
Well, why don't we give other people a chance, and I'll respond later.
Our second speaker will be Bruce Klingner. I don't think there's any need for me to explain on him, because he is the most frequent, showing up, in major U.S. news media. So I especially I have to send my special thanks, for your taking time out of your very busy schedule even today. So he spent 20 years working in the intelligence community, including the CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency. So he has spent many years in handling North Korean issues. Without any further ado, I'd like to invite Bruce. Today we have two Bruce, so we have Bruce Brinkner and Bruce Bennett. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my 5th trip to Korea so far this year, and I'll be back in 2 more weeks. So I feel like it's a second home. I've been coming here since 1993. I'll cover 2 main themes in my short remarks. The first is smoke and mirrors, and the other is a tale of 2 cities. Now, smoke and mirrors is a phrase used to describe how a magician will fool you. He'll get your attention with some shiny object on something that's actually not important, but he makes you think it's important, while he's actually doing the trick with the important thing, out of sight, and so you're easily distracted. And so I think really Kim Jong-un is doing that now, and he's fooled Presidents Trump and Moon and Secretary of State Pompeo. Now, all 3 of them have claimed that North Korea have agreed to do things that actually they haven't agreed to. They haven't certainly said it publicly, and they haven't put it in writing. So we're seeing claims by the U.S. that North Korea has accepted CVID or FFVD or whatever acronym the administration is now using, and it's really not the case yet. And so the result is that we have on the U.S. side, President Trump has already backed away from the maximum pressure. He's backed away from the initial demands for rapid denuclearization, and he seems to now have accepted North Korea's action-for-action plan, as opposed to, we would not give any benefits before North Korea does it all. And so President Moon has been eager to provide a long and ever-growing list of economic benefits or economic promises to North Korea, all of which would be violations of UN resolutions and or U.S. law if they were to be implemented without getting dispensation. And if you look at the Panmunjom, the Pyongyang, and the Singapore summit communiques, I think they're very typical of the agreements we've had, the flawed agreements we've had with North Korea in the past, and they're very short, they're very vague, they don't clearly delineate responsibilities by North Korea, and they tend to have a long list of benefits to North Korea, and then denuclearization is included in the last paragraph or the second to last paragraph, often in about a half sentence of North Korea promising to work towards denuclearization, which is a far weaker commitment than they made in the September 2005 six-party talks joint statement. So in a way, we're moving backwards. And I'd say Secretary Pompeo is the latest victim of Kim Jong-un's magic. He just got back from the trip and it claimed that we've made progress, but what he needed to do is really add meat to the very bare bones of the Singapore summit. And he, to his credit, he said that we've just taken one step on what will be a very long path. And a member of his delegation said we're in for the long haul, or we are in for a long haul. But even 4 months after the Singapore summit, we still don't even have an agreed upon definition of seemingly straightforward terms such as denuclearization or even the Korean Peninsula. North Korea's definition seems to include the island of Guam, as well as U.S. submarines and aircraft carriers, et cetera. Right now, what Mr. Pompeo seems to be doing is, rather than pushing for North Korea to really come forward and identifying the steps it would take to come into compliance with 11 UN Security Council resolutions, the focus instead seems to be identifying the date and the venue for another U.S.-North Korea summit. I think it's premature to rush into that, rather than but we should have instead the diplomats ironing out the differences, making progress in a more traditional bottom-up approach. Now, I think it is encouraging that both Pompeo and Kim agreed to working level meetings, and hopefully that will work on, I think, some of the issues that Gary Seymour talked about, of identifying requirements and linkages and deadlines or timelines. So we move forward in a more, I think, comprehensive, integrated approach, rather than just having things done at a summit. Now, turning to what I call A Tale of Two Cities, which is a reference to the famous Charles Dickens book, and if we were to sort of misquote Mr. Dickens using the famous opening, it might be, the North Korean regime had the best of intentions, the North Korean regime had the worst of intentions. This is the age of wisdom, it is the age of foolishness. And by that I'm referring to the very different views that are coming from Washington and from Seoul. And in talking with officials both here and in Washington, you get very different views of not only how closely we're aligned, but even the process for moving forward. So there are concerns rising in Washington about President Moon's eagerness to improve inter-Korean relations without a commensurate progress in denuclearization. Seoul is increasingly seeing denuclearization as a U.S.-North Korea issue rather than an international one as required under the UN resolutions. And in the Panmunjom and Pyongyang declarations, President Moon pledged a lot of tension reduction or economic benefits without getting anything really in return from North Korea on denuclearization. So there's a lot of grandiose pledges, but not any real progress with Panmunjom. So one of the things that President Moon has done is seemingly adopted North Korea's talking points, particularly when it comes to a peace declaration. And I believe that a peace declaration is not a wise policy. North Korea has seemingly shifted the narrative, or successfully shifted the narrative, away from denuclearization towards requiring the U.S. and its allies to first take tension reduction steps, or making North Korea feel less threatened, although, of course, it's North Korea that has repeatedly attacked and threatened the U.S. and South Korea since 1953, and not the other way around. So in the past, North Korea always claimed that the combined military exercises were the biggest impediment to denuclearization. And once President Trump unilaterally agreed to cancel those exercises, and that we've seen 4 or more exercises since then have been canceled, North Korea just sort of pocketed that, said it was unimportant, and now says a peace declaration is the most important step. So South Korean officials sort of try to get the U.S. to sign a peace declaration by really downplaying its significance. They'll say it's a very short text, it really means nothing, it really has no impact, it's symbolic, it's political, so why not sign it? And my response would be, well, what objective are you trying to achieve by having us sign that declaration? What quid pro quo will you get? What will you be handed by North Korea in return for doing this step, which we can't undo? Or if it's really just to make North Korea feel less threatened, warmer and fuzzier, how will that change North Korean behavior? And none of the advocates have been able to provide an answer. So it seems like a feel-good gesture that really has no achievable objectives, and it has a number of serious ramifications. And I think on both the security side as well as the pressure side. On the security side, although President Moon and others have assured us it will have no impact on the alliance or U.S. forces, it could set us on a slippery slope of, if you signed a peace declaration, how can you not sign a peace treaty? And why do you have so many troops here? Why do you have a nuclear umbrella, et cetera, et cetera? And I think we'd see large groups protesting in the streets, thanking the U.S. service for our service, but thank you, it's time for you to leave. And on the pressure side, it would just, I think, further undermine international resolve on enforcing the required UN sanctions. And we've seen certainly China and Russia backing off on that. We've seen, as I've said, President Moon pushing for exemptions or a reduction in sanctions enforcement. And the U.S., President Trump has said he doesn't even want to use maximum pressure, and that there are 300 North Korean entities that the U.S. is not sanctioning. Now, that would be 300 North Korean entities in violation of U.S. law for which we have evidence, and we're not sanctioning them. And that, to put it into context, is about the same number of North Korean entities cumulatively sanctioned during 9.5 years of the Obama and Trump administrations. So what I would say is, on the peace declaration also, how would this be any different from the 20 or more declarations or statements the U.S. has already made, pledging non-hostility and that we won't attack them using conventional or nuclear arms? None of those documents or verbal pledges had any effect on North Korean behavior. How is this piece of paper supposed to be any different? So what I would say is in conclusion, that Pyongyang has resorted to its usual negotiating tactics of the past 2 decades to drag out negotiations, eke out benefits for incremental progress on peripheral matters, while holding back progress on the real issue of denuclearization. And there's a long history of failed diplomatic efforts at getting North Korea to denuclearize. Now, that doesn't preclude yet another attempt, but we do have to be skeptical and wary as we move forward. And I think the Trump and Moon administration should learn from the mistakes of the past and not rush in with yet another vague agreement. And that negotiators should emphasize that North Korea must demonstrate progress towards denuclearization and reject the demands by Pyongyang for action before they take significant steps. So in this year of summit euphoria, to go back to where I started with Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, we've already experienced the spring of hope that Charles Dickens wrote about. Let us hope that North Korean intransigence doesn't lead us to the winter of despair. 감사합니다.
Thank you for your brilliant quotation from Charles Dickens. If I give some just prompt, question for thought. I mean, the end of war declaration is not time-honored old issues. You know, usually people say armistice and then peace treaty. So even if my memory is correct, even till 2007, the end of war declaration cannot to surface of the negotiation table. So it's kind of some pre-arrangement before peace treaty, because peace treaty needs two-thirds approval from Senate. So maybe is there any difference between end of war declaration and peace treaty? So maybe, but it seems that you are trying to treat all these items on the same level. But what about having some difference? Given the legal status. That's my first question. And second, from Korean, the Korean people's attitude, two Bruce is maintaining most, the conservative, position. So from your position, when UN and the United States start, even partial one, the alleviation of sanctions. So what is the most visible and appropriate sign for Western society to start thinking of that possibilities? Especially, is there any difference between UN Security Council based sanction or unilateral sanction by United States on the name of the secondary boycott? And based on your excellent information collection capability, so I'd like ask you some personal comment on some rumor that on the site of the first U.S. North Korean summit in Singapore, the decision of the selection of Singapore was a little some deserve hindsight. I can say it's mistake by U.S. government because they select Singapore. The North Korea should depends on some other countries because they don't have such airplane for him to fly such a long distance. So as a result, the selection of Singapore entail the active participation and role of China. So I think it is intentional or inadvertent mistake. That is my question. So maybe you may respond right now or during the second turn. Our next speaker will be Douglas Powell. He is working as a vice president for studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Doug has served as twice for the Republican president, Reagan and Senior Bush. So now he's working dictionary in Republican side. So especially he is almost a top expert on U.S.-China relations. So maybe we expect another big insight, especially in the implication of the Chinese involvement in this process. Okay, let's welcome Doug Powell.
Well, once again, thank you, President Pak. Thank you to the forum and to KFAS for making this possible. My colleagues are in the process of exposing the many flaws and challenges and intricacies of this process of denuclearization and management of relations with North Korea. And I'd like to take up your last question to Bruce, and to talk a little bit instead about the U.S. relationship, the relationship of China to the Korean Peninsula, its strategic impact. And I would not start from the Singapore summit, which is the nominal topic for this panel, but go back to the January 1st speech by Kim Jong-un, and then the very dynamic inter-Korean diplomacy that was featured during and after the Olympics here in South Korea, which have really changed the situation quite fundamentally and exposed some contradictions in American policy. Go back in time to middle to late 2017. People in China in official capacities were very frustrated with their government's policy. Here you have an important peninsula appended to northeastern China with all kinds of turbulence in the north and economic dynamism in the south. And yet China's own influence in both of these parts of the peninsula were significantly diminished in the time preceding January 1st. China had, for a number of reasons, isolated and frozen relations with North Korea. They did not like the dynastic succession there. They didn't like the nuclear testing. And they had ideas for improving relations which we didn't quite agree with, the freeze for freeze proposal and the like. But China really was not in a position to do much except exert negative influence through sanctions on the north and undeclared sanctions on the south after the acceptance of a THAAD deployment here in South Korea for defense against the North's offensive missile capabilities. The sequence of events from January 1st on, and the Singapore summit to be included, has now significantly improved China's strategic position in the region. They have, as you've seen, 3 visits to China by the DPRK leader. This was not possible before for the reasons I mentioned. They now are talking openly about it, a visit by Xi Jinping as the maximum leader of China to Pyongyang fairly soon. The Chinese have put themselves in a very competitive position for influence on the region. They haven't yet relieved the undeclared sanctions on South Korean businesses and the like, but it's clear that they're moving in a direction to try to improve relations with both parts of Korea that they were not in a position to do just a year ago. At the same time, the United States is embarking on a policy adjustment toward China, which is of great consequence, or at least has the potential to be of great consequence. And the Vice President Pence's speech last week outlining in jot and tittle almost every conceivable complaint we have about Chinese behavior, with the one exception of no mention of Hong Kong and its diminished autonomy under Xi Jinping's rule in recent years. This is a kind of declaration of Cold War, and it's being seen as such. The underlying logic of the argument is that the United States nurtured a baby tiger in China, and now we're dealing with a full-grown tiger that's a danger to ourselves. And the solution to this, as devised by the administration, but not quite explicitly publicly stated yet, but it's apparent in everything they're doing, is to de-link the U.S. economy from China's economy, to deny that tiger the food, money, the outside sources of energy and the like to keep the economy going, therefore make China less threatening by making it less economically strong. This is a very bold concept and has a few problems, however, because it requires other countries to cooperate. And this has been combined with a unilateralist approach by the new administration, where we have been shunning multilateral arrangements as rapidly as we can. Even the bilateral arrangement with South Korea came under tweet attack again this weekend by President Trump, saying that South Korea pays nothing for the defense provided by the American presence on the peninsula. So as we go forward, we're going to see the United States making requests to governments, say Australia, to stop selling iron ore to China, to Korean major companies that are part of the supply chain, to de-link that supply chain and move their factories out of China or and go elsewhere. To me, this is not just a little problematic. This is inherently unimplementable. You can't make this policy happen. You can't tell the 14 countries on China's periphery that they should cease doing business with China, even as their markets and infrastructure integration with China have been increasing and are vitally important to their economic development. And you are going to make them unwilling to cooperate on a lot of other issues. And this gets us back to Korea. How do we hold coalitions together to maintain the pressure on North Korea to go toward denuclearization when we're undermining the multilateral effort at every turn and going after not just easy things that foreign policy people can discuss over dinner tables or in office settings, but the very economic underpinnings of the economies of the countries we're asking to join in the cooperation. So I suspect that the upshot of this is going to be a failed policy by the United States. We saw something like this in 1993-94 when Bill Clinton came in. He had declared during his election campaign that he was going to punish the butchers of Beijing. And when he came to office, he said the United States was going to cease granting most favored nation status to China until China emptied its prisons of its human rights prisoners. A year and a half later, the policy failed. The American business community made it pretty clear to Clinton this was not a policy that would work, and he sent an emissary to Beijing to beg for a few prisoners to be released to give us face. We have a concern about face. To give us face as we changed our policy back to supporting MFN. One difference from that period today is the American business community is more divided about the benefit of working in China. And so I think it would very much like to continue the economic cooperation, even when it's not as beneficial in every respect as they'd like. But they're not organized to resist what the administration is going to do. So that resistance is going to come from outside the United States, less than from inside. I'll just make one final observation before we go on to the Q&A and the rest. Despite what I just said, President Trump is enjoying tremendous support for his North Korean policy. The polls are favorable. People I talk to who are four-star general retirees and the like, who normally would be the most skeptical people on the planet, think that peace has arrived on the peninsula because Trump has stopped saying fire and fury and started saying he's in love with the North Korean leader. This is a very peculiar circumstance, and it's likely to prevail through the upcoming midterm elections. Whenever the summit between Kim and Trump takes place, I think the public will be eager for good news and not looking to discover bad news in that outcome. And so Trump will have a strong wind behind him in the short term, which will propel him even more to think he has success in the future, with a policy, especially toward China, which I think essentially is deeply flawed and doomed to fail. So, thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Yeah, even though you didn't mention in detail, if we have some broader perspective on the future of North Korean nuclear issues, if we fail in properly dealing with North Korean nuclear issues, and eventually in Asia-Pacific region, we have eventually two nuclear powers, that is China and North Korea. In that case, it might trigger chain reaction in other, the remaining part, the remaining parts going nuclear to balance such nuclear terror. So in that case, the strong candidate might be South Korea and Japan and Taiwan, if I don't know, Australia. So to balance, some nuclear terrors in this area, where it became in the wake of the rise of Asia, which will lead whole world economy. So, which means it's a very important area. What do you think of when such chain reaction will be triggered? In which situation, such nightmare will come into reality. That is my, No, it's up to you.
You missed. On the question of the chain reaction and timing, China's view is not to have that proliferation of nuclear weapons capable states, obviously. But that's a preference among a number of preferences. And the first preference China had was stop the testing of nuclear weapons. It would like additionally to achieve no expansion of nuclear capabilities to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, or wherever. I think it feels that as a more manageable prospect. I would turn the question around and ask, when will the countries of Tokyo, Seoul, and elsewhere conclude that the U.S. has become so unreliable they have no alternative? So the question hinges on American reliability, sustainability of policy, more than it does on the infection or chain reaction from North Korea.
Thank you. My next speaker will be another Bruce, Bruce Bennett. Maybe don't have any misunderstanding that Bruce has always conservative views.
I'm actually trying to get my other panelists to change their names to Bruce.
Dr. Bruce Bennett is working as a senior researcher at the Rand Corporation. I think he already visited Korea more than 110 times, right? Okay. So he's a real expert in military exercise and especially combined forces. And there's some rumor that he himself came up with the idea is combined forces. Are you sure? Not? So maybe he is championing of massive reporting on Korean Peninsula security issues. So maybe he has his own unique analysis on the future of North Korean Peninsula's security situation. Yes, let's welcome Bruce Bennett.
Well, my thanks to you, President Pak, and to the forum. And I'm going to start out and shock you. I think President Moon was brilliant with his April 27 agreement, the declaration. Why? Because he hid the key nuclear provision. It's not in item 3.4, it's in item 1.1, where North Korea and South Korea agreed to fully implement all previous agreements. That includes the 1992 denuclearization declaration. And that declaration says North Korea will have no nuclear weapons, no production capability, no importing of nuclear capabilities, no uranium enrichment, no plutonium reprocessing. Kim Jong-un agreed to all of those in April 27 declaration. That means we don't have to be convincing Kim that he's got to commit to that. He's already committed to that. In fact, if you look at the June 12th agreement, Article 3 says, in the spirit of the April 27 agreement, because even the American NSC personnel recognized this meaning of the April 27 agreement, that he's already agreed to go to zero. So my congratulations to President Moon. He did a wonderful job of packaging what was necessary. So now where do we stand? Well, North Korea is not denuclearizing, they're nuclearizing. They're making more nuclear weapons, they're making more missiles, so they're violating the agreements they've signed twice this year in going in exactly the opposite direction. That's got to raise some real questions in our mind, but let me take it to the more logical question. Kim Jong-un said, as I understand it in Pyongyang when he met with President Moon, that he is prepared to give up all of his nuclear program by the end of President Trump's administration. Okay, well, if that's true and he is so concerned about the North Korean economy, why is he still spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year on building nuclear weapons that he's going to surrender in the next year or two. That is totally illogical. And it makes you wonder, who is the real Kim Jong-un? We don't know for sure, but I will suggest in a minute 3 possibilities. But before that, let's ask the next question. He's talked about disabling Yongbyon. If Yongbyon is suddenly totally gone, does that mean North Korea is going to be denuclearizing? And the answer is no. They've got other facilities in other places. They will continue building nuclear weapons. So that is not all that is needed to get to not denuclearization, but just even to a freeze. That's not enough. So who are these 3 Kims that we might be facing? I think there's the cautious Kim, where he's worried about internal rebellion against him taking action. That's a possibility of denuclearizing. But if that's really true, is he really saying that he's a weak leader and can't control the events in North Korea? I don't know, but that suggests that's a concern. He could just be a hard bargainer, hoping that he can get the best deal possible by holding out. Yeah, but he may be stretching that a little bit. We don't know what the future's going to hold. And the third possibility is he doesn't intend to denuclearize at all. He's just stalling to complete the ICBM force he thinks he needs to be able to coerce the United States and deter the United States. We don't know which of those 3 is true, so we need to be testing Kim Jong-un. So how do we test him? I think the key at this stage are 3 key steps that we need to take. Number 1, we need to go back and say, Kim Jong-un, China talked about freeze for freeze, so let's freeze your nuclear program. Now, we want to freeze it at the stage where we started doing these exchanges. You told the South Korean national security advisors in early March that you wanted a summit meeting to talk about denuclearization, to make arrangements for it. So from that period of time, you've produced what? 3 to 6 or 7 nuclear weapons? We think you ought to surrender those, because that would be the point at which we ought to freeze. And we think we'd like to also have you stop production. To do that, item 2, I can wait for a full declaration on North Korea, but we're going to get 50 boxes of so many pages we're not going to understand them anytime soon. I want something very simple. There are 4 key nuclear production facilities: reactors, uranium enrichment, plutonium reprocessing, nuclear weapon assembly. I want North Korea to give us the half-page list of the perhaps 10 facilities they have that do those functions in North Korea, with a name, a location, a function, and a capacity. Only need a half page. You could produce that in an hour if you're knowledgeable about the program. Now, my expectation is if we get that list, it's only going to be 5 or 6 long. But that then gives us an opportunity, because then we can go back to North Korea and say, oops, I don't see the Kangsung uranium enrichment facility on this list. How about if we go there tomorrow and check it out? Now, Kim Jong-un could say, I'm not going to give you the list. I'm not going to allow you to do a challenge inspection of that facility. But then he's telling us he's Kim number 3 and stalling. He's not really trying to work the program. And that's a useful piece of information to gain. Once we have a list of those 10 or so facilities we think is reasonable, I think the final stage is we need to tell him we want IAEA monitoring in every one of those facilities with a termination of production. We're prepared to negotiate if he stopped building up his nuclear program. But if he's still building his nuclear program, it's really hard to trust him, given the commitments he's been making. Now, that's nuclear. We also have the missile issue. His desire to produce ICBMs, his order earlier this year, as I understand it, of some 70 trucks that would carry ICBMs for launching, those things need to be controlled too in a similar manner. Bottom line, It seems to me we need to try to get him to a point where he's telling us which Kim Jong-un he is. Is he only reluctant? Well, okay, we can deal with that, but we can only deal with it if he's frozen his program. And then we can work out the deals of the next steps. With a frozen program, he still has more than enough nuclear capacity to deter outside intervention. And so he doesn't lose really anything. I think that's important, but it's also important for us to then be trying to decide what we can give him in exchange. And there are many, many possible exchanges. The biggest mistake is sanctions relief. Sanctions are something that hold together as long as there are no holes in them. Think of the dikes. When you get a hole in a dike, it starts to expand and to develop, and things get worse very quickly. If he gives up his 3 or 5 or 6 nuclear weapons he's produced so far this year, that's not a dike. It's a marginal give up that he would be doing on a substantial program. So there's not a symmetry there, and we need to be careful about our actions and what we do. But we have diplomatic actions, we have information actions, we have many alternatives. I like the notion of inviting North Korea to send 100 graduate students to American universities in social science, in music, in art, in business. We'll scatter them across the United States and let them gain different experiences. Those are things we can do. He wants us to demonstrate that we have a changed relationship. That would be a good way to do it. But there are many other exchanges and actions like that we could be taking and should be taking in the short term to meet the demands that North Korea presented in early July. I hope we can move in those directions. Thank you.
Okay. If I give some quick, response to your argument, do you have any hard evidence of North Korea's, continuous, stockpiling of nuclear program, including 3 to 5 more nuclear weapons every year? So is there any based on hard evidence or just based on your personal intuition? That's my first question. And second question, another Bruce, mentioned that North Korea already pocketed the very invaluable, one of the invaluable few leverages, that is, suspension of military exercise. There's some argument on its nature of the suspension of military exercise between United States and Korea. Is it irreversible or reversible? So North Korea's argument is, that is reversible. Anytime United States can resume a military exercise. So what is your counter argument, response to the North Korean side, the argument on that issue?
Let me just be very brief on this. Hard evidence, and North Korea doesn't let us see a lot of things. But I have seen reports in the media, which I, at this stage, have nothing better to judge, that say that there has been evidence of missile production and nuclear weapon operation of their facilities. So I think there's some evidence. It's not determinate, but hey, if North Korea lets us come in and monitor those facilities, we'll know for sure, one way or another. On the suspension, one of the biggest problems of suspending the exercises is the Americans normally serve 1 year in Korea. If none of the Americans have ever participated or planned to carry out the exercises, who's going to set up the next set? This is a case where you've got to have the expertise to continue the exercises, and there are certainly Koreans who will have that expertise. But from the American side and trying to make sure that things the United States wants to have included, we start to lose that. we also start to lose a lot of the individual interactions. You know, Ulchi Freedom Guardian is done in August. Why? Because most of the Americans turn over in June and July in Korea. That is done to educate the Americans not only on the nature of war plans, strategy, and so forth, but also to introduce them to their Korean colleagues and get them starting working together. We can't stop that. That's something that's got to continue, or what is already feeling like a little tension in the alliance could get greater. Thank you.
Thank you. Our last speaker, not least speaker, will be Scott Snyder. He's a senior fellow for Korea Studies at Director of Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at Council on Foreign Relations. Now he's leading CFR's independent task force on policy toward the Korean Peninsula. Now, recently he published many articles and many books. One of the conspicuous good book is South Korea at Crossroads. So maybe I expect you will serve as a balancer between Republican and the Democrats. Okay. Let's welcome Scott.
Yeah. Well, Ambassador Park, thank you so much for the chance to participate in this discussion. And I do feel a lot of pressure to show that we all aren't victims of groupthink in Washington. And so my first way of doing that is to declare that I'm not going to change my name to Bruce. But I think that, you know, this is such an interesting moment. And I think that we have a saying in English, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. But it doesn't say anything about what happens if you're fooled the third time. And so we're right at a moment where I think the critical question that we have to ask ourselves is what makes this time different? And I think it's actually incumbent upon those who are pushing forward on this to try to explain what makes this time different. President Moon actually addressed that last month in an address at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he said, well, the difference is that now we're following a leader-led process. But actually, for a lot of people, that doesn't evoke a lot of confidence, actually, in leader-led processes. We want to hear something more. And so I've been thinking, well, what is different after the Singapore summit? And I think the big difference is that at the Singapore summit, President Moon and Chairman Kim decided that we were going to pursue not the kind of process that we had in the past that was focused on denuclearization with peace as a byproduct, but instead a process that is focused on peace with denuclearization as a byproduct. And I think that it's an interesting experiment. I think we should try it, but I also see a lot of risks related to trying that experiment. And a lot of it really comes down to what the implications of that process mean for sequencing. And so I have to acknowledge, as has already been stated, number one, that we don't have a framework yet that links peace and denuclearization processes so that they can be pursued and achieved together. And that is something that I think is absolutely critical that we need. We need a common destination and we need a roadmap. Secondly, I think we have to remind ourselves, if it's going to be a peace-led process, that the peace process has to include both the conventional and the nuclear, or it doesn't lead to peace. Peace without denuclearization is not a sustainable peace. And we can't trade peace in the conventional realm for a refusal to pursue denuclearization. Thirdly, when I read the North Korean statements, including the North Korean foreign minister's statement at the UN, it's pretty clear that on the North Korean side, they're focused on trust building as a prerequisite for denuclearization. But we focus on and want to see verified action as an evidence of commitment to denuclearization frankly, maybe in return for evidence of U.S. commitment to peace. And for that reason, I actually would be comfortable with a declaration for declaration, a declaration of end of war for a declaration from North Korea of materials and facilities as a symbol of an aspiration to achieve those goals. If we stated that it was an aspirational declaration and didn't have other binding significance. And yet, it appears that that actually is not where we're going. Fourthly, we're focused on momentum. We want this process to move quickly, but we don't want it to move so quickly that it undermines the ability to do effective verification. And so we have to be careful about that. And fifth, I just want to reiterate that this issue, the tension in terms of calibrating sanctions easing with the pressure that is necessary to ensure that North Korea doesn't prematurely exit from the process is absolutely critical. And so how do we do that? This is my conclusion. U.S.-South Korea coordination is critical in order to manage this process. Before the summit process started, the Moon administration stated that one of the critical lessons that they had learned from the previous efforts at engaging North Korea was that the inter-Korean wheel had to go in tandem with the U.S.-North Korean wheel. And the U.S.-South Korea alliance is the axle that holds those wheels together. It's going to be a long process. It's going to be bumpy terrain. There are risks that the axle could break, and yet, if we want to make progress, it has to stay in place. And so that would be, I think, the critical thing that we need in order to effectively manage a peace-led process that has denuclearization as a byproduct.
You raised very interesting questions. What's special or what's different this moment? If we look back last 25 years, North Korean deal, I think this time is very special in the sense that North Korean leader himself show up at the negotiation table for the first time. In the past, he is subordinate or involved in negotiation. So he could easily disavow or complain or scold. But this time he cannot blame himself. So in that sense, he should make something acceptable to outside the world. So that's why we have to we should not lose the momentum opportunity. So that is my comment. But on the President Trump's side, during the previous administration, virtually the North Korean nuclear issue has been a little set aside. So in that sense, it is great work by President Trump who put top priority on North Korean nuclear issues, which means that he make North Korean issues as a deal-breaker issues, especially in dealing with China. So in that sense, I think we should highly appreciate President Trump's, the role. But the question is sustainability. How such top priority status will be sustained by President Trump? That is my counter question to you.
Well, I'll answer that very quickly. For President Trump, as long as he sees North Korea as an opportunity, and if we look across the foreign policy horizon, there are not many successes. As long as he sees it as an opportunity, he will stick to it, and he will continue to come back to it and try to remind everyone of the accomplishments that he's made.
Okay, thank you. So actually, I prepared 13 questions before we have this meeting. I was going to introduce the details of the question, but given the time constraint, I will skip that presentation. But I will just raise still there's two valid questions. That is, first one is when and where next U.S. North Korean summit should be held. So it's kind of just guesswork. So in terms of, we don't know actually what has been negotiated, but what and where and when is most recommendable. That is my question. And second question is that what kind of advice or recommendation I want to suggest to Korean government, when they have fourth summit, South-North summit in South Korea. So there is some still valid two questions. So with such understanding, I'd like to give some very quick, second round talk from Gary. You don't have to limit it to my questions, whatever you want, okay.
Well, first let me respond to your question to me about the technical value of dismantling Yongbyon. I said it was a modest step. Why is it modest? Well, on the positive side, it would reduce North Korea's overall capacity to produce fissile material. And in particular, as far as we know, North Korea has no other source of producing large quantities of plutonium. So if those reactors are dismantled or disabled, then that would be a limit on North Korea's overall stocks and ability to produce. But it's modest because, as both Bruces have said, North Korea has additional facilities for producing fissile material, especially highly enriched uranium, and they can continue to operate those facilities even if Yongbyon is dismantled. And of course, dismantlement of Yongbyon does nothing about the existing stockpile of nuclear weapons. So I agree with what the other panelists have said, that once we have an agreement in place to dismantle Yongbyon, which could take a year or two to actually implement, we should be focusing on a moratorium on fissile material production nationwide, which means that North Korea will have to declare and allow access to its secret nuclear production facilities. Whether Kim Jong-il will actually do that, I honestly don't know. I think it's quite likely that he's not prepared to accept an overall limit on further production of nuclear weapons. But I think the only way to find out is to offer him a very substantial benefit in return. And for me, that means sanctions relief and South-North economic cooperation. So to answer your question, President Park, I think South Korea's got tremendous leverage. If we believe that Kim Jong-un is serious about growing the economy, improving prosperity in order to strengthen the country, because North Korea is very weak as long as it has a weak economy, South Korea is going to be one of the main sources of economic assistance and cooperation. And most of that is currently prohibited by sanctions. So what I hope that President Moon does in his meetings with Kim Jong-un is to make it clear that the spigot of South Korean economic assistance and cooperation can't be opened unless North Korea takes more serious steps toward denuclearization. And the first such serious step is to declare and shut down the secret nuclear sites. It may not work. North Korea may not be willing to do that, but I think that's our best hope of achieving at least a cap on the current nuclear production capability. In terms of when the next summit takes place, I don't think where matters very much, but as I said in my talk, I hope that President Trump doesn't rush into a summit very quickly before the working level people have at least settled some of the crucial details about the deal on the table to dismantle Yongbyon in exchange for a peace declaration. And I fear the North Koreans may think that they can get a better deal directly from Trump, so they may not be willing to negotiate in good faith at the working level in hopes that Trump will get impatient and go to a meeting without proper preparation, and that once he's alone with Kim Jong-un, he will make all kinds of gifts to Kim Jong-un, which is what happened at Singapore.
Thank you. Bruce?
I'd agree with my colleague Bruce Seymour about the summit. Is the venue doesn't matter. The timing, I hope they don't do it quickly, because if they do it quickly, then it just shows we're not prepared. We're focused more on flashy objects, shiny objects, like Trump was in the first summit. On the peace declaration or end of war declaration versus a peace treaty, there are a lot of terms being used, those as well as peace regime. Peace regime is sort of the most bizarre phrase for Americans, because regime usually has negative connotations. And some have defined peace regime as sort of the feel-good gestures that would lead you towards a peace declaration or some document. Others would say once you sign a document, then the good feelings you all have towards each other are the subsequent peace regime. A lot of folks in Washington have been focusing on peace declaration versus peace treaty. And even when you talk to international lawyers, they're saying we're in new legal territory. There's nothing in the armistice describing how it is replaced. I think most people think, though, a peace treaty is more tangible, it is more legal. It would likely remove the legal justification for United Nations Command, but not Combined Forces Command or U.S. Forces Korea, which are covered under the Mutual Defense Treaty between Washington and Seoul. A peace declaration, as I said, it's a feel-good gesture. It has no impact legally. But as I said, many of us are concerned that it does create the momentum. It undermines the political legitimacy of UNC and CFC and USFK, and you've really gotten nothing in return. Now, some people will say, well, why is North Korea all of a sudden talking about it? They've been talking about it since the 1950s. They often couched it in terms of a nuclear-free zone in Northeast Asia. That term was used up until about 1995, and then between 95 and 2005, they tended not to talk too much about it, and then since 2005, it's been more peace treaty or peace declaration. But all of those terms have been used in the context of removing U.S. forces, abrogating the defense treaty, and removing the nuclear umbrella, et cetera. So it's something they've long been going after. I believe we should skip over a peace declaration and go for negotiations on a peace treaty, which was one of the 6 working groups in the 6 party talks, which North Korea walked away from. But I think a peace treaty should come at the end of what would be long negotiations to reduce the North Korean conventional threat to South Korea and our forces here. And that would be like the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, which we had with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. On the alleviation of sanctions, we do need to distinguish between the UN and US actions. But both of those didn't have immaculate conceptions. They were all a response to North Korean actions, violations, acts of war, acts of terror, human rights violations, etc. So you don't just undo a law because the criminal doesn't like it. But right now, what the analogy I think of is, it's like North Korea is the criminal sitting across the table from a police officer, and the U.S. is sort of the police officer and says, well, Mr. Kim, I see you've got a very long list here of violation of law, but you say you want to turn over a new leaf, you want to act differently, so we're willing to, once again, try to see if you can go on parole. Could you tell me how you're going to come into compliance with the law, and then maybe we can alleviate some of these punishments? North Korea tends to be more like the criminal, just sort of sitting back saying, so what are you going to give me to convince me not to rob a bank today? It's just the wrong way. They shouldn't be rewarded for coming into compliance. But on the UN resolutions, sanctions, a lot of those are trade sanctions. So those might be more negotiable. You could get to a point where maybe for every 5 nuclear weapons they abandon, they get to export another 100,000 tons of coal or import another 100,000 tons of oil, something like that. But the US sanctions are usually laws. And so in that case, it's not like just some big ball of cheese that you can slice 5% of sanctions or 8% of sanctions off. What you have to identify is, which laws do you not want to enforce? the North Korean human rights violations, so we just accept that crimes against humanity is okay and we just won't have any punishment for that, or it's okay for at least North Korea to commit federal crimes such as money laundering or counterfeiting currency. So do you remove those laws worldwide or only for North Korea or the Chinese entities that are helping them? So, and also if you look under sections 401 and 402 of the North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act, there's a long list of things North Korea has to do before the president can even have a 1-year suspension of sanctions. So it's not as easy as some think. And finally, on the military exercises, think in terms of, say, the best Korean golfer or the championship baseball team. Do you think right before a big golf match or before a championship game, the coach said, don't practice for a month or two? You know, you've hit a lot of golf balls, you've hit a lot of baseballs. Why practice? You're really good at it. No, they practice up until the match. And they're not dealing with life and death situations like the military. Or think of a police SWAT team, Special Weapons and Tactics, who are the highly trained team that have to go into a hostage situation. You know, you could tell them, well, just don't practice. Maybe a few more hostages get killed in the next situation. That's not what you do. You have to practice every day. And my son's a United States Marine, and they are constantly training and practicing because they can't get it wrong. Thank you.
Doc, you have the floor.
I'll just speak to this question of the timing and venue of a potential summit. I agree with the other panelists that there's no need to rush into a summit, and that the Singapore example was a good example of how not to do things with North Korea. I also think there's very powerful, from the point of view of Mr. Trump, as best we can judge, a very powerful argument not to rush into a summit. He's got everything going for him right now. Given he's not going to win over any Democrats and a lot of independents, he has to keep his base. And at 3.7% unemployment and a pretty good GDP rate and skyrocketing stock market, that could change any minute, but right now it's still very high. He's going into his midterm elections with a victory with Kavanaugh in the Senate, narrow victory, but a victory. Marginal but important improvements in the trade agreements with Mexico and Canada. So he doesn't need to add, you know, airplane pictures of flying into Pyongyang to show he's a peacemaker as well. So I would hope he would back off. However, he may actually see flying Air Force One into Pyongyang as just the exclamation point on the pre-campaign efforts, and may want to do it. I've written about this in the hopes that he won't. On the venue, I just spoke to Pyongyang. I mean, the venues are malleable everywhere. They got pretty good coverage out of the Singapore venue for both sides, and they could find another one just as well. Certainly there'd be a lot of logistics challenges to trying to do it in Pyongyang, but a lot of appeal to have the world's largest parade put on for Mr. Trump's benefit, because he seems to like parades.
Okay. Bruce.
Thank you. Many of you are businessmen. Would you cut a deal with another business where you just make a deal and say, well, we're going to work out the details later. All we want to do is say we're going to exchange $100 million worth of goods with each other, but later we'll figure out the conditions. You don't do that. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So this notion of let's rush into some kind of end-of-war agreement, well, let's step back from that. Who is more hostile towards the other side in Korea? Is it American hostility that the North perennially complains about, or is it North Korean hostility towards the United States, which is dominant? You know, Americans don't train our children to hate North Koreans and how to kill them. It's not something that happens in America. That is a level of indoctrination that suggests that there is not only concerns about a hot war, but a very serious Cold War going on. If we're going to have an end-of-war declaration, that Cold War needs to stop. And that means an end to North Korean indoctrination that the U.S. is the eternal enemy. I mean, why would we accept an end-of-war agreement without that? And said a little differently, did World War II in Europe end with an end-of-war agreement? I'm not aware of it. If North Korea and South Korea wanted to sign such an agreement today, couldn't they do it? So why are they insisting on involving the United States in this agreement? And I think that they're insisting on it. I think the North is insisting on it because it's hoping that it will indeed, as my colleagues have suggested, undermine the UN command. It will undermine the U.S. military presence in Korea. I don't think we want that kind of condition to exist. So what do we ask of North Korea? I think before there's a second summit meeting, I think we have to get something concrete from North Korea. You know, Kim said, let's come and talk about denuclearizing. Okay, so let's see an example, Mr. Kim. Let's have you surrender some nuclear weapons. Let's have you shutter some of your nuclear production facilities. We're not asking you to totally dismantle them, just shutter them and monitor them by the IAEA. So these are things that are not irreversible at this stage. But as a first step, before we have another summit meeting, something like that seems to make sense. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Scott?
Yeah, well, I would just say that when the framework that links the peace and denuclearization objectives is ready, that's the time to have the summit. But I think maybe the interesting question really that you asked is, well, what should happen when Kim Jong-un comes to Seoul? You know, what could he do? And I can think of a lot of different things that it would be fascinating to see him do. I just don't know if they're feasible. But if we just think about the Singapore market stroll, I think that it's good for Kim to see as much as he can of everyday South Korean life.
Okay, I have two-finger request from Gary. Okay.
So I just, on this peace declaration, I personally see it as more symbolic than anything else. Now, I respect the views of others that there are risks involved, but I think it's too late. I think Trump has already agreed to do a peace declaration of some kind. So to the extent that there are risks, it's a question of mitigating those risks by carefully drafting the peace declaration so it doesn't go beyond things we've already said many times about not posing a threat to North Korea. But I think we should, and I think the same with you know, the Yongbyon dismantlement. I think Trump has already accepted that as the quid pro quo. So rather than wish that something else would happen, I think we should think about how to manage the situation to do as little damage and as maximum benefit as possible.
Thank you. Today I'm very honored to have many ambassadors who are stationing in Korea and with other diplomats. On behalf of Diplomatic Corps in Seoul, I'd like to invite Ambassador Simon Smith of the United Kingdom for some comment. So,
thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Park, and thank you very much to all the panelists for what I thought was a really super encapsulation of the very complex picture we're looking at here, and I would say in some respects a rather conflicted picture. We've heard people say it's the same old North Korea. We've heard people say it's a new opportunity. We hear this every day here in South Korea. We've heard people say it's a long haul, you need patience. We've heard people say we want concrete, we want it now, we need to inject pace into the negotiations and so on. It is a very conflicted situation. It's a situation with many ambiguities in it. So what is our best way of going forward? And I wondered whether it might help just to offer a very brief personal reflection, which comes from, and it addresses the question of what is different. Can I just offer you perhaps a personal reflection on what feels to me different as someone who has, and I confess, has spent years dipping out of the North Korea problem, many years in fact, and has recently returned to them, But I recall, and I can see Gary laughing because we were in touch with each other regularly during this basis. I recall when I was head of the Northeast Asia Department of the Foreign Office in London. At the time, that was October 2002, at the time of a pretty major setback in the international community's engagement with North Korea. At a time also when it was part of my job to be introducing the first North Korean ambassador to the United Kingdom, to the way we did things in the UK, actually to give him our best possible support in understanding how the UK ticked, how the international community ticked. It was something that we wanted to ensure that our new relationship with North Korea actually brought. It was to establish this new basis of understanding. Now this brings me to my answer to the question as to what's different, because I think that if we recall and if we distill what has been the basic rationale of our approach to North Korea as a message from the international community that says there are huge costs in non-cooperation, in not cooperating with the concerns and the desires of the international community. On the other hand, we can talk to you about the significant benefits that can accrue from your decision in North Korea to cooperate, to understand the concerns of the national community, to align with them and work with them. Now, I think what is different is that coming back to this issue after a few years dealing with other complicated stuff, I feel that it's that part of the message that is now better understood in North Korea, but that we need to work a lot harder to entrench that understanding. The part of the message that says, if you do not cooperate, we will make life difficult for you, we will impose sanctions and costs and so on, I think has always been understood, if not appreciated. It's always bothered me the extent to which the other part of the message that says there are rewards for cooperation has not been understood. And again, I think it was clear to us in the UK when we set up our diplomatic relationship with North Korea that this would be a long haul, that understanding that message, that actually the world out there is not intrinsically hostile to North Korea, but if North Korea makes the right choices, can be cooperative. I think that is still very much a long haul, but I think in that context, I rather align with the members of the panel who are looking at the advice that says, have a clear understanding of the difference between gesture and transaction. Don't undervalue, don't underplay the value of the gesture in continuing this process of ensuring that North Korea understands that there really is cooperation and a better future out there if they make the choice to cooperate. I think for the time being we have no alternative but to, in a sense, sustain a kind of period of what I would call productive pressure. That means the maintenance of sanctions. It means ensuring that sanctions helps to encourage North Korea to the right decisions and to maintain a creative kind of tension. And so at the moment, again, on the question as to whether we need to rush into things, whether we need to display patience on the other hand, again, I think that there is a lot to be said for patience, a lot to be said, though, for a patience that maintains, as I say, a kind of creative and imaginative tension. One that says, that ensures that the value of the opportunity is underlined, but makes absolutely clear, including by the maintenance of sanctions, that until there is progress, that tension and the pressure remains in place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Now I'd like to open the floors. We have only 5 minutes to go. I think I already raised many questions on behalf of you, but I'd like to invite 1 or 2 questions, which we didn't cover. So, is any? Okay, Mr. Ambassador. Yeah.
Gordon Flake.
Professor Yale.
Yeah, Gordon Flake from the Perth U.S. Asia Center. This was a magnificent panel, but it was also a panel in a vacuum of Northeast Asia and of the peninsula itself. So I was wondering if, can you hear me now? I wonder if you might address some of the broader regional and global implications of the issue. In particular, It seems to me that the real tension here is how do we make progress towards peace or denuclearization without jeopardizing alliance relationships, say with Japan, Australia, others in the region, or without undermining the broader system of standards and norms, you know, the rules-based order when it comes to security like the NPT. That seems to be the fundamental tension that underlies much of the discussion but wasn't addressed specifically.
Questions? Okay. The gentleman in the middle of the table.
Thank you for sharing the knowledge with us. I'm Joseph Lee from Korea International Trade Association. I have two questions. The first one is the prospect of inter-Korean trade, how and when it's going to be exempt from sanctions. It's going to be prior to other measures. And second one is the prospect of NK, North Korea, to join international regime or institution like IMF, World Bank, or WTO. Thank you.
Yes, it's a little economic issues, but unfortunately, all of you are not specialized in economics. But I ask you, okay, please.
As long as North Korea is on the state sponsors of terrorism list of the United States, U.S. representatives are required to vote against North Korea joining or asking for assistance from international financial institutions like the IMF and others. It's a requirement. Inter-Korean trade, virtually anything is a violation of UN resolutions or U.S. law, either through the financing or the direct thing. So that all is a matter of law. On some of the other issues, on Gordon's point, I think it's very important that the U.S. maintain the alliances and the non-proliferation treaty. If we allow North Korea sort of exemptions from the non-proliferation treaty, I think that undermines the treaty as well as global non-proliferation goals. And so I think it's important we uphold that. And also, if we give them sort of dispensation from UN resolutions, then what is the worth of UN resolutions? I think something that the U.S. should not do, and I think unfortunately we have been doing, is straining relations with key allies through comments by President Trump or actions, you know, where he seems to equate alliances with business deals. If we don't get 100% reimbursement for our troops, you know, why are we there? Well, many of us, I think, have tried to advocate that alliances are in U.S. interests. We are there not only for our own interests, but shared interests that we have, you know, I think the responsibility to maintain peace and stability in Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and Europe. So it is something that we should not strain relations with our allies by, say, calling the Chorus Free Trade Agreement the worst agreement in history, and then accepting marginal changes to it, and then declaring that it's a major new success. It's something I think could have been done at a lot lower decibel level with a lot less breaking of crockery.
Okay.
So I just want to build on what Bruce said. I think one of the dangers of a peace declaration that we haven't talked about yet is that President Trump, who doesn't think U.S. troops should be in South Korea anyway, may use it as a reason for either charging South Korea more for stationing U.S. forces in Korea, or even to reduce or eliminate U.S. forces in Korea. So I hope if the U.S. and the ROK agree to issue a peace declaration, I hope there's an understanding between Moon and Trump that that should not lead to a disruption of the U.S. military presence. Because I think under normal conditions, there's not a contradiction between maintaining the alliance and peace building and, you know, denuclearization. But under a president who doesn't value alliances very much, I think that tension becomes much more a problem.
You first.
I think with regard to Gordon's question, we have to ask, what's been happening over the last 6 to 9 months? In many ways, from a U.S. perspective, it's the reinstitution of strategic patience. We're allowing North Korea to continue to grow their nuclear program. If we do that, let's say for another 3 to 5 years, and North Korea has fielded 20 ICBMs with nuclear weapons on them, has gotten up to 100 nuclear weapons, I don't know what the number will be, but perhaps that high. What does that do to the relationships internationally and within the region? Does it generate, I mean, look before, a year ago, there was lots of discussion about ROC need for nuclear weapons. Now that, in the peace initiative process now, is receded, but I don't think it's entirely gone away. We have to worry that if this program is not capped at very least, there are some really serious concerns about what could happen in the region in terms of defensive posturing. In the end, we've got to tell Kim, actions speak louder than words. We're not going to compensate you just for your words. You got to act.
Okay. Scott?
Yeah, I just can't resist the opportunity to disagree with a Bruce, because with regards to the IMF, I think that one of the paradoxes of sanctions application is that we are isolating North Korea through maximum pressure, and in some ways that enables them to be a soprano state. But the IMF interaction in the initial stage should be designed to project standards of economic governance into North Korea and to require steps toward transparency that are the beginning of North Korea being integrated with the international community. And frankly, I think that is a threat to a regime that has thrived on isolation.
I hope all of you enjoyed, a very great discussion on these important topics. I have to wrap up by reminding all of you of what Senator Menendez, mentioned. We have to acknowledge the risk at play, but at the same time, we should be able to take full advantage of this historic opportunity. Thank you so much for your tolerance and great participation for 1.5 hours. Thanks so much.